The first sign that something was wrong arrived quietly, without drama or warning, the way truly serious problems often do. It was a weekday morning, the kind that begins with habit rather than thought, when routine carries the body forward before the mind has fully woken. The house was still, wrapped in that thin layer of early calm that settles just after sunrise, and everything about the day felt ordinary. That sense of normalcy made what came next feel unreal, like a glitch in reality that the brain struggles to process at first. The faucet turned, the handle rotated smoothly the way it always had, but nothing followed. No rush, no sputter, no gradual cough of air, just silence. The sink stared back, dry and unresponsive, as if it had forgotten its purpose overnight. At first, it seemed like a simple issue, a momentary lapse that would correct itself. The handle turned again, then another faucet, then another. Still nothing. The house, once so reliable, suddenly felt hollow. Water is one of those things people rarely think about until it's gone. It's so fundamental, so embedded in daily life, that its absence feels wrong on a primal level. In that moment, the realization settled slowly, bringing with it a faint edge of unease. Pipes do not simply stop delivering water without reason. Systems fail, yes, but they usually leave clues behind. Noise, leaks, warnings. This was different. This felt intentional. The neighborhood itself had always been a strange mix of order and quiet tension. Perfectly aligned lawns, identical mailboxes, and sidewalks scrubbed clean of personality gave it the appearance of harmony, but beneath that surface ran a current of control. Rules were posted, enforced, and whispered about. Letters appeared on doors with alarming regularity. Fines were issued for reasons so small they felt almost theoretical. It was the kind of place where authority didn't just exist, it searched for relevance. The Homeowners Association had been present from the day the house was purchased, an invisible but ever-watchful presence that framed life here. Fees were paid, forms were filed, and compliance was maintained not because it made sense, but because resistance required energy most people didn't have. The board members changed faces over the years, but the attitude remained constant. They operated with the certainty of people who had never been challenged in any meaningful way. Still, nothing in the past prepared anyone for water being shut off without notice. No warning letter had arrived. No overdue bill sat unpaid. Every statement had been settled, every requirement met. The idea that this could be a simple mistake felt increasingly unlikely as the minutes passed. The silence in the pipes became heavier, pressing in on the house like an accusation. A glance outside confirmed something unsettling. The neighboring houses showed signs of life. Sprinklers ticked and clicked as they arced water across green lawns. A car was being washed 2 doors down, water splashing freely onto the driveway. The problem was not the area. It was not the city. It was this house, singled out, isolated, cut off. The realization sharpened into clarity with uncomfortable speed. This wasn't a malfunction. It was a decision. Somewhere, someone had chosen to turn a valve, flip a switch, or issue an order that resulted in this house being deprived of water. The question was not how it happened, but why. There was a strange calm that followed that realization, the kind that comes when confusion gives way to focus. Panic would have been easier, but panic wastes time. Instead, the situation demanded attention, documentation, and patience. Every detail mattered now. The timing, the lack of notice, the selective nature of the shutoff, all of it pointed toward deliberate action. The Homeowners Association had a history of overreach, but this crossed a line that most people never expect to see crossed. Water was not a decorative feature or a shared amenity. It was a necessity, a utility governed by laws far older and more serious than any HOA bylaws. Cutting it off was not just petty, it was dangerous. And yet someone had done it anyway, apparently confident they would face no consequences. That confidence intrigued more than it frightened. It suggested ignorance, arrogance, or both. Somewhere within the paperwork of this property lay details the board either didn't know or didn't believe applied. The land itself had a history that predated the neighborhood, the association, and the carefully printed rulebooks. Long before identical houses lined the streets, water had moved through this ground under a different set of rules. The house had been purchased with those rules in mind. The documents were dry, technical, and easy to overlook if one didn't understand their weight. Water rights, easements, and access agreements rarely matter to people until someone tries to interfere with them. But when they do matter, they matter more than almost anything else. They are not suggestions. They are legal realities tied to the land itself. The decision to cut off the water had turned an inconvenience into a test. It revealed how far the association was willing to go and how little it understood about what it was attempting to control. Somewhere on a board member's desk, a piece of paper likely sat stamped with authority, listing a violation that didn't exist and a fee that had never been owed. That paper had been enough in their minds to justify action. What they failed to realize was that authority borrowed from ignorance collapses quickly under scrutiny. This was not a fight that could be won with threats or letters. It was a matter of records, history, and law. And unlike many homeowners who would scramble to restore service as quickly as possible, this situation presented an opportunity to expose something much larger than a temporary loss of water. The house itself seemed to wait, silent but steady, as if it understood that this was not the beginning of defeat but the opening move of a longer story. The dry pipes were not an ending. They were an invitation to look deeper, both literally and figuratively. Beneath the surface of manicured lawns and polished authority lay truths the association had never bothered to learn. This was the moment where most people would call, complain, and beg for restoration. This was the moment fear would normally take control. Instead, it became a moment of preparation. Evidence would be gathered, records would be reviewed, cameras would be ready. Because when power is misused, the fastest way to strip it away is to let it expose itself. The water being shut off was not the crisis the board believed it to be. It was the spark that illuminated everything they had been hiding behind: fake fees, selective enforcement, and unchecked control. And while the taps were dry, the ground beneath the house still held what it always had: resources, rights, and leverage far beyond anything the HOA could touch. As the day moved forward and the silence in the pipes continued, the path ahead became clearer. This was no longer about restoring water. It was about uncovering the truth, documenting the panic that would follow, and revealing just how fragile false authority becomes when it collides with reality. The next steps would not be rushed, because the deeper this went, the more the story would reveal, and what came next would ensure that this moment was remembered not as a loss, but as the beginning of something the board never saw coming. By midday, the absence of water had shifted from a strange inconvenience into a calculated problem that demanded structure, and structure begins with paper. While the house remained quiet, stripped of the most basic utility, the situation outside continued uninterrupted, a contrast that sharpened awareness rather than dulling it. This was not a failure of infrastructure, but a choice made somewhere behind closed doors, and choices leave records. The first step was not confrontation, but confirmation. The slow, methodical act of tracing responsibility backward through documents, policies, and assumptions the homeowners association relied upon to project authority. Every property transaction produces a mountain of paperwork most people never revisit after signing. But buried inside those pages are truths that outlive board members, management companies, and even neighborhoods themselves. The original purchase documents came out first, followed by survey maps, county records, and water access filings that had been preserved more out of habit than necessity. As pages spread across the table, patterns began to emerge, not just about this house, but about the land beneath it, land that had once existed without boundaries drawn by matching fences and identical driveways. Long before the association ever printed its first violation notice, the property had been tied to a water source governed by rights older than the neighborhood itself. Rights that did not disappear simply because new houses appeared around them. The deeper the review went, the clearer it became that the HOA's authority stopped well short of where they believed it extended. They controlled aesthetics, fees, and shared spaces, but utilities tied directly to land rights were another matter entirely. The water serving this house was not a courtesy provided by the association. It was a legally recognized access protected by agreements that could not be overridden by board votes or administrative whims. That distinction mattered more than anything else, because it transformed the situation from a dispute into a violation. Somewhere, someone had acted without understanding what they were touching. The realization didn't bring relief so much as confirmation, a tightening sense that the association had stepped into territory they were not equipped to navigate. As the hours passed, the silence from the HOA itself became louder than any response could have been. No emergency notice arrived. No explanation was offered. That absence spoke volumes. Organizations confident in their authority move quickly and loudly, but uncertainty breeds delay. The board had likely expected panic, a rushed call, a frantic request for restoration accompanied by apologies and compliance. Instead, they were met with quiet resistance, a refusal to play the role they had assigned. That refusal created pressure, and pressure reveals cracks. The management portal showed something interesting when reviewed closely, a line item marked overdue that did not correspond with any previous billing cycle. The amount was small enough to feel arbitrary, the kind of number designed to provoke compliance rather than scrutiny. There was no invoice explaining it, no documentation justifying it, only a label that implied wrongdoing where none existed. That phantom fee became the centerpiece of the entire action, the excuse used to justify something far more serious than a late charge. This was not enforcement, it was improvisation. The more closely the records were examined, the more obvious it became that the association systems were built on assumptions rather than verification. Fees appeared without explanation. Notices referenced rules without citing sections. Authority was asserted, not proven. For most homeowners, that was enough. Challenging it required time, confidence, and a willingness to endure discomfort, things the association counted on people lacking. But this situation had crossed into a realm where discomfort was no longer the primary concern. Cutting off water was not a passive penalty. It was an aggressive act with legal consequences. As that reality settled in, another thought emerged, one that shifted the approach entirely. If the board had been willing to act this boldly, they would not retreat quietly. They would double down, attempt justification, manufacture explanations after the fact. That meant documentation mattered now more than ever. Screenshots were taken, dates were recorded, every interaction or lack thereof was logged carefully. Silence could be as incriminating as a statement if preserved correctly. Meanwhile, the neighborhood continued its routine, unaware that something was unfolding beneath the surface. Cars came and went. Lawns were watered. Life moved forward, insulated from the disruption contained within one house. That isolation was part of the association's power, the ability to make an individual problem feel invisible. But invisibility cuts both ways. It allows things to be observed without interference. Cameras were positioned discreetly, not to provoke but to capture, because if the situation escalated, it would do so publicly. The board's next move would reveal their understanding, or lack of it, of the mistake they had made. As afternoon turned to evening, a notification finally appeared, not an apology or explanation, but a generic reminder referencing outstanding balances and compliance expectations. The language was cold, procedural, and conspicuously vague, avoiding specifics while implying fault. It was written to intimidate, not inform. That alone confirmed what the documents had already suggested. This was not a measured response. It was an attempt to maintain control through ambiguity. The problem for the board was that ambiguity collapses under light. The water rights documents were clear, the timelines precise, the lack of notice undeniable. There was no scenario in which this action could be framed as appropriate. Someone had acted first and thought later, assuming authority would protect them from consequence. That assumption was about to be tested. The decision was made to continue waiting, not out of passivity but strategy. Every hour without water strengthened the record. Every automated message without substance added to the pattern. If the board escalated, it would be captured. If they hesitated, that hesitation would speak to their uncertainty. Either way, the story was writing itself. What began as a shutoff had become an exposure of how fragile unchecked power becomes when it steps outside its lane. The association believed it controlled the narrative, but narratives belong to those who document them, and this one was no longer theirs to shape. Beneath the calm exterior of the house, momentum was building, quiet and relentless, driven not by anger but by clarity. The next chapter would not open with confrontation, but with reaction, because once authority realizes it has overreached, it rarely admits it willingly. Instead, it scrambles, and that scramble would reveal everything the board had hoped to keep hidden, setting the stage for consequences they never anticipated. By the third day without water, the situation had evolved from an internal assessment into a visible stress test of authority, and the pressure was no longer contained within paperwork and quiet observation. Systems designed to dominate through routine collapse when routine is interrupted, and the homeowners association was beginning to feel that disruption in ways it did not expect. The neighborhood itself had started to notice, not because of any announcement or protest, but because silence behaves differently when it lingers. The absence of water forced changes in behavior that could not be fully hidden. Bottled supplies arrived in bulk. Movements became deliberate. What should have been invisible inconvenience became subtle spectacle, and subtle spectacle breeds curiosity. Curiosity, in turn, erodes control. Somewhere within the association's structure, questions were being asked that had not been part of the original plan. Why had there been no immediate compliance? Why was there no frantic call demanding restoration? Why had the target not folded the way others always did? Those unanswered questions created anxiety, and anxiety changes behavior. The next notice arrived late in the afternoon, not through official mail, but through an informal channel, a sign that confidence was slipping. It referenced policy without citation, authority without foundation, and consequences without clarity. It read less like enforcement and more like reassurance aimed inward, a reminder to whoever sent it that power still existed if it was declared loudly enough. That declaration failed to achieve its purpose, because declarations do not override facts. Each vague statement only reinforced the impression that the board had acted first and searched for justification afterward. Meanwhile, the cameras quietly recorded every vehicle that slowed near the property, every pause, every glance that lingered a second too long. Board members are rarely subtle when they are uncertain. They circle, observe, and attempt to gather information without committing to action. Those movements revealed more than any written communication ever could. They showed hesitation, not dominance. The illusion of authority depends on momentum, and momentum was gone. Inside the house, the strategy remained unchanged. No engagement, no emotional response. No attempt to negotiate away rights that had never belonged to the association in the first place. Waiting was not surrender, it was leverage. Each additional hour without water compounded the seriousness of the violation. What might have been framed as a misunderstanding on the first day now approached something far more difficult to excuse. This was no longer a momentary error, it was sustained action. Legal implications grew heavier with every passing day, and anyone with even basic knowledge of utility law would have recognized that fact. That recognition likely occurred unevenly across the board, creating internal fractures. Some members would have begun to sense danger, while others, insulated by ego, doubled down on the belief that authority alone would shield them. Those two instincts are incompatible, and incompatibility breeds conflict. By evening, the conflict surfaced indirectly. A maintenance truck appeared near the street, idling longer than necessary, its presence justified by nothing observable. It did not approach the property, did not perform any work, and eventually left. That pointless display was not maintenance. It was intimidation, a visual reminder that the association still believed it controlled infrastructure. But control asserted without action only highlights uncertainty. If the board truly believed in its position, the water would have remained off indefinitely without comment. Instead, these gestures betrayed nervousness. They were searching for a reaction, any reaction that could restore the familiar rhythm of dominance and compliance. None came. The absence of response forced the association into a psychological corner. Power functions best when it is invisible, when people comply without question. Once it is questioned, even silently, it must prove itself, and proof requires competence. Competence was precisely what the situation now demanded and what the board lacked. The records were clear. The authority they believed they held did not extend into this territory. That reality began to seep outward in ways they could not fully contain. A neighbor asked a casual question. Another lingered longer than usual during an evening walk. Information moves quietly in planned communities, carried through observation rather than announcement. People notice patterns. They notice when one house stands apart. They notice when enforcement feels uneven. And they notice when something feels wrong. The board's attempt to isolate the issue inadvertently highlighted it. Instead of discouraging attention, they invited it. By the end of the third day, the association faced a dilemma of its own making. Restoring water without explanation would be an admission of it. Continuing the shutoff increased legal exposure. Doubling down risked public escalation. Each option carried consequences, and the absence of a clean exit revealed how poorly thought out the original action had been. This was not strategic enforcement. It was impulse disguised as authority. Somewhere, a board member likely replayed the decision in their mind, searching for the moment where confidence had tipped into recklessness. That moment had already passed, and now the fallout was unavoidable. The house remained without water, but the ground beneath it held steady, anchored by rights that did not bend to pressure or intimidation. The association's power, by contrast, had begun to show its limits. It thrived on compliance, not resistance, and it had no plan for what to do when resistance arrived calmly and documented everything. The first crack in the facade had formed, and cracks spread not because of force, but because of weakness. As night settled and the neighborhood lights flickered on, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. This was no longer a private inconvenience. It was the opening act of a larger unraveling. The next phase would not come from action taken by the homeowner, but from reaction forced out of the association itself, because once authority begins to doubt its own footing, it exposes itself through haste, contradiction, and fear, setting the stage for a confrontation they could no longer avoid. The fourth day dawned with a tension that felt heavier than the silence in the pipes, a pressure that no longer belonged solely to the house, but had begun to spread outward into the mechanisms of the homeowners association itself. Because authority, when challenged quietly, tends to respond loudly, and loud responses often reveal desperation rather than strength. By now, the absence of water had transformed from an inconvenience into an unmistakable statement, not made through protest or complaint, but through endurance, and endurance unsettles systems built on immediate compliance. The association could no longer pretend this was an isolated billing issue or a minor enforcement action, because time had turned it into something undeniable, something that could not be smoothed over with templated emails or vague policy references. That realization triggered escalation, but it was escalation without coordination, the kind that happens when multiple people try to regain control independently, each move undermining the last. The first sign came in the form of conflicting communications, messages that contradicted one another in tone and implication, suggesting internal disagreement. One notice framed the shutoff as a temporary administrative measure pending review, while another doubled down on the claim of non-payment without offering evidence. These inconsistencies were not accidental. They were symptoms of a board no longer unified in its narrative. When authority fractures, it often does so quietly at first, behind closed doors, but the effects leak out through paperwork and behavior. The lack of a single, coherent explanation exposed the truth more clearly than any admission could have. Someone on the board had begun to realize the severity of the mistake, while someone else remained committed to asserting control at any cost. That internal conflict created delays, reversals, and half-measures, each one adding to the record of mismanagement. Outside, the neighborhood's awareness continued to grow. What had once been subtle curiosity hardened into observation. People noticed the maintenance truck that appeared again, this time parking closer, lingering longer, as if proximity itself could substitute for authority. No repairs were made. No explanations were given. The truck left just as useless as before, but its presence had been witnessed, discussed, and quietly questioned. Displays meant to intimidate rarely work when they lack purpose, and purposelessness invites scrutiny. Inside the association, pressure was mounting from another direction as well, because cutting off water is not just a symbolic act. It intersects with legal frameworks that exist far above neighborhood governance. Management companies, insurers, and advisors tend to grow nervous when actions cross into regulated territory, and nervous advisors ask uncomfortable questions. Those questions force accountability, and accountability is precisely what the board had hoped to avoid. The longer the shutoff continued, the harder it became to frame it as a simple oversight. It now required justification, documentation, and explanation, none of which existed in usable form. The phantom fee that had started it all began to look increasingly dangerous, not because of its amount, but because of its origin. Fees without invoices, penalties without notice, enforcement without due process all point to systemic abuse, and systemic abuse does not disappear when discovered. It multiplies in consequence. Somewhere in the background, emails were likely flying between board members and management staff, each attempting to shift responsibility subtly to create distance between themselves and the decision. That instinct to deflect is common when people sense exposure, and it often leads to mistakes. Language becomes defensive, claims become broader and less precise. Authority is asserted rather than demonstrated. Every one of those shifts was visible in the communications that trickled out, each one more revealing than the last. Meanwhile, the strategy inside the house remained unchanged, and that consistency became its own form of pressure. No rebuttals were issued, no demands were made. Silence was maintained not as submission, but as a mirror, reflecting the association's actions back at them without distortion. In that mirror, they saw escalation without progress, force without legitimacy, and confidence unraveling under its own weight. The cameras continued to document everything, capturing not drama but behavior, the kind of behavior that tells a story far more compelling than any confrontation could. A board member arrived one afternoon, walking the perimeter with exaggerated purpose, glancing repeatedly toward the house as if expecting a reaction that never came. That walk was not enforcement, it was anxiety made visible. Authority does not need to pace, it acts decisively. Pacing belongs to uncertainty. By the time evening fell, the association faced a narrowing set of options, none of them comfortable. Restoring water quietly would invite questions they could not answer. Continuing the shutoff risked regulatory involvement. Attempting to justify it publicly would expose contradictions already embedded in their own records. They were trapped by their initial assumption that no one would push back, that fear would do the work for them. That assumption had failed, And now they were discovering that power built on intimidation collapses quickly when intimidation is met with patience. The water remained off, but the balance of power had shifted perceptibly. What the association once wielded effortlessly now required effort, coordination, and explanation, all of which increased the chances of error. Every additional action they took created another thread that could be pulled, another inconsistency that could be highlighted. The escalation they initiated had not restored control. It had stripped it away layer by layer. As night settled over the neighborhood, the quiet felt different than it had on the first day. It was no longer the quiet of confusion, but the quiet of anticipation, the stillness that precedes a decisive turn. The association had revealed its willingness to overreach, its inability to correct itself quickly, and its fear of transparency. Those revelations could not be undone. They would shape everything that came next, because once authority shows its limits, it invites challenge not just from one house, but from everyone who has ever wondered how far that authority truly extends, setting the stage for consequences that would soon move beyond inconvenience and into accountability. By the fifth day, the strain within the homeowners association had reached a point where it could no longer be masked by procedure or posture, because pressure, when applied unevenly, does not simply disappear. It migrates inward, forcing people to confront realities they have spent years avoiding. The water was still off, and that fact alone had transformed the situation into something the board could no longer frame as routine enforcement, no matter how hard they tried, because routine enforcement resolves itself quickly, while this lingered, heavy and unresolved, like an accusation that refused to fade. The association's leadership structure, once confident and orderly on paper, began to reveal its true nature, which was not unity but hierarchy built on assumption, where decisions were made impulsively and defended collectively until defense became inconvenient. Now, inconvenience had arrived, and it was no longer abstract. Advisors were asking questions. Management staff were requesting clarification that did not exist. Insurance representatives were beginning to look closely at exposure, and exposure is the one thing organizations built on control fear more than defiance. Each inquiry forced someone on the board to answer for actions taken without foresight, and those answers were inconsistent, shifting subtly depending on who was asked, which only amplified suspicion. The phantom fee at the center of the shutoff became increasingly difficult to defend, not because it was large or controversial, but because it had no origin story that could withstand scrutiny. It appeared in the system without explanation, tied to no invoice, no notice, no prior communication, a digital artifact masquerading as authority. That kind of artifact works only when no one challenges it. Once challenged, it becomes a liability. Inside the board, conversations likely grew tense, with some members beginning to sense that the issue was no longer about enforcing compliance, but about containing damage. Those members would have pushed quietly for resolution, for restoration of water accompanied by minimal explanation, while others, driven by ego or fear of appearing weak, would have resisted, insisting that backing down would set a precedent. That internal tug-of-war created paralysis, and paralysis is fatal to the illusion of control. While they debated, time continued its work, turning what might have been a defensible mistake into a sustained violation. Outside, the neighborhood's attention sharpened further. What began as curiosity had evolved into quiet judgment. People noticed patterns not just of action, but of silence. They notice when authority acts without clarity and lingers without explanation. The association's failure to communicate openly did not preserve order. It undermined trust. Trust, once fractured, does not require proof to erode further. It requires only consistency in missteps. The maintenance truck returned again, this time accompanied by a clipboard and a performative inspection of nearby infrastructure that carefully avoided the actual point of contention. That display fooled no one. It was not maintenance but theater, and theater performed without audience engagement feels hollow even to its performers. Cameras captured it all not as spectacle, but as evidence of unease. The board's attempts to reassert dominance through presence rather than resolution only emphasized how little control they truly had over the situation they had created. Meanwhile, the house remained steady, functioning within its limitations without complaint, its quiet endurance becoming a silent rebuke. That steadiness denied the association the emotional reaction it expected and relied upon. There were no angry messages to point to, no threats to cite, no misconduct to reframe as justification. The absence of reaction left only their own behavior on display, and behavior without context tells its own story. By now, the water rights documentation had been reviewed multiple times, not out of doubt, but out of precision, ensuring that every clause, every easement, every historical agreement was understood in full. These were not vague protections. They were explicit, binding, and indifferent to the existence of an HOA. They belonged to the land itself, and land does not negotiate. That reality loomed over the board's deliberations, whether acknowledged or not. Any attempt to justify the shutoff now risked exposing ignorance so profound it bordered on negligence. The association's authority had always relied on the assumption that homeowners would not know where its limits lay. This situation shattered that assumption. Knowledge had replaced fear, and knowledge is corrosive to unchecked power. As evening approached, a shift became perceptible, subtle but unmistakable. The communication slowed. The tone softened, though without apology. Language that once implied certainty now suggested review, assessment, and reconsideration. These were not words of confidence. They were words of retreat disguised as process. Retreat, however, requires coordination, and coordination was precisely what the board lacked. Each softened message contradicted earlier firmness, creating a paper trail of inconsistency that would be difficult to explain away. Internally, the pressure likely intensified, with individuals seeking to distance themselves from the decision, to establish plausible deniability before consequences arrived. That instinct is human, but in organizations it often accelerates collapse because accountability cannot be diffused indefinitely. Someone signs the order, someone authorizes the action, someone approves the fee. Those signatures exist, even if no one wants to claim them. By the fifth day, the association's problem was no longer the homeowner's resistance, but its own structure, which had been exposed as reactive rather than principled. The water shutoff had become a mirror held up to the board, reflecting not strength but fragility, not order but improvisation. Each hour that passed without resolution deepened that reflection, making it harder to look away. The house, still without water, stood as a quiet testament to the difference between temporary inconvenience and lasting rights. The association had gambled on fear and lost, and now it faced the consequences of a system that worked only when no one pushed back. As night settled once more, the sense of anticipation grew sharper, because the board was running out of room to maneuver. Pressure had turned inward, and when power begins to fracture from within, it rarely recovers quietly. The next chapter would not be defined by what the homeowner did, but by what the association, cornered by its own decisions, would attempt in desperation, setting the stage for a moment where control would finally slip beyond their grasp entirely. By the sixth day, the atmosphere had shifted from tension to inevitability, because once power begins to crack under its own contradictions, the only thing left is exposure, and exposure does not require confrontation so much as light. The water was still off, and that continued absence had transformed the situation into a living record of overreach, one that no longer belonged solely to paperwork or internal debate, but had begun to exist in the physical world where it could be seen, documented, and remembered. The Homeowners Association had now entered the most dangerous phase of its own making, the phase where actions are taken not to resolve a problem, but to manage perception, and perception management fails the moment it collides with objective reality. It started subtly, with a board member arriving unannounced in the late morning, their presence justified by nothing but a sense that something needed to be done, some gesture made to reclaim control. The arrival itself might have gone unnoticed in another context, but nothing about this context was ordinary anymore. The cameras were already running, not out of provocation, but preparedness, quietly capturing the body language, the pacing, the hesitation that defined someone no longer certain of their authority. What unfolded was not confrontation but performance, an attempt to assert relevance through proximity alone. The board member walked the boundary slowly, pausing as if inspecting something that did not require inspection, glancing repeatedly toward the house, clearly aware of being observed, but unable to decide whether that observation was a threat or an opportunity. That uncertainty was the first thing the camera recorded, and uncertainty is not flattering when worn by those who claim power. There was no announcement, no explanation, no corrective action taken. The visit accomplished nothing except documentation, and documentation was precisely what the situation demanded. The association had underestimated how dangerous visibility could be because their authority had always functioned best in the shadows of assumption, where few people questioned process and fewer still demanded proof. Now, proof was the only thing that mattered. Later that afternoon, the escalation arrived, clumsy and unmistakable. Another notice appeared, this one more forceful in tone, attempting to retroactively justify the shutoff by referencing generalized authority over shared utilities, a claim so broad it bordered on absurd. The language was defensive, layered with phrases meant to sound official while avoiding specifics, a hallmark of people trying to build legitimacy out of thin air. The problem was that every word of that notice contradicted the documents already in hand, and contradictions do not disappear simply because they are declared irrelevant. Instead of restoring control, the notice did the opposite. It confirmed that the board was now aware it needed justification and did not have it. The camera captured the arrival of that notice as well, its timing, its delivery, and the lack of any accompanying action to restore water. That gap between words and deeds spoke louder than any threat. By now, the situation had reached a point where inaction by the association was no longer neutral. It was evidence. Each hour without resolution compounded the seriousness of the violation and narrowed the board's options further. Internally, the pressure must have been suffocating, because this was no longer a matter that could be resolved quietly. The presence of cameras changes calculations. It forces people to consider not just what they can do, but how it will look when reviewed later, stripped of context and examined frame by frame. The association had never planned for that level of scrutiny, and it showed. Movements became cautious. Communications became delayed, decisions stalled. The confident efficiency that once defined enforcement was replaced by hesitation and contradiction. The camera did not provoke these changes, it simply recorded them. The neighborhood noticed as well. A small cluster of onlookers formed briefly across the street, drawn not by spectacle but by intuition, the sense that something unusual was unfolding. No one approached. No one interfered. Observation alone was enough. Authority depends on the belief that it is unquestioned, and the moment people start watching instead of complying, that belief erodes rapidly. The association's representatives were no longer operating in a vacuum. They were operating under witness. That witness extended beyond the immediate scene, because cameras create permanence. What they capture cannot be undone by apology or explanation later. That permanence weighed heavily on every subsequent move the board considered. By early evening, the association attempted a partial retreat disguised as process, issuing a statement that claimed the matter was under review and would be resolved pending verification. It did not explain why the water remained off. It did not address the lack of notice. It did not acknowledge the rights attached to the land. It simply promised future action, a tactic often used when present action would require admitting error. That promise, however, arrived too late to restore confidence. Review is not resolution, and pending verification is not justification for sustained harm. The camera captured the statement as well, contextualizing it against 6 days of silence and contradiction. In that context, the words rang hollow. The association had crossed a threshold from authority into accountability, and accountability does not operate on promises. It operates on facts. The fact was simple and undeniable. The water had been shut off without legal basis, and it remained off despite mounting evidence of that illegitimacy. The camera ensured that fact could not be reframed later. As night fell, the board's position grew more precarious. They were now trapped between restoring the water and explaining themselves, or continuing the shutoff and escalating their exposure. Neither option preserved the illusion of control they valued so highly. The camera, once ignored as irrelevant, had become the central element in the equation because it transformed a private abuse of power into a public record. It did not shout or accuse, it simply observed, and observation was enough to destabilize everything. The house, still dry, stood illuminated by porch lights and quiet resolve, its silence now amplified by the knowledge that every misstep by the association was being preserved intact. The balance had shifted decisively. What began as a water shutoff had evolved into a documented unraveling, and the board could feel it slipping away. Because once authority is forced to perform for a camera, it stops being authority and becomes theater, and theater cannot enforce anything when the audience no longer believes the act. The next chapter would begin not with another notice or another idle truck, but with a moment of panic, because exposure does not end with observation. It ends when those being observed realize they have nowhere left to hide. By the 7th day, the silence around the house was no longer empty, but charged, thick with the kind of anticipation that comes when systems realize they have lost control of the timeline. Because nothing accelerates panic like the understanding that events are now unfolding faster than explanations can keep up with. The water was still off, but that fact had become almost secondary to what was happening behind the scenes within the homeowners association, where urgency had replaced confidence and improvisation had replaced planning. Meetings that were once routine and brief stretched longer, voices rose, and decisions stalled as the weight of the situation finally landed where it belonged, not on the homeowner who had endured days without water, but on the board members who had authorized the shutoff believing it would pass unnoticed. The realization that it would not pass quietly, that it was now documented, observed, and potentially irreversible, triggered a kind of institutional panic that rarely shows itself in public but leaves fingerprints everywhere. Emails were sent and unsent. Draft statements circulated and were discarded. Responsibility became a moving target, each participant subtly reframing their involvement in an effort to appear peripheral rather than central. Panic does not produce clarity, it produces noise, and that noise was beginning to leak out in the form of rushed decisions and contradictory actions. One moment the board leaned toward restoration, the next they hesitated, fearing that restoring service would be interpreted as an admission of wrongdoing, a fear that revealed just how far they believed the situation had already gone. They were no longer asking whether the shutoff had been justified, but how damaging its reversal might appear, a distinction that underscored how disconnected they had become from the reality of their own actions. Outside, the neighborhood sensed the shift even without direct knowledge of internal debates. Authority has a rhythm when it is confident, a predictable cadence of enforcement and compliance, but that rhythm had fractured, replaced by irregular gestures that felt reactive rather than deliberate. Board members who once moved with assured purpose now avoided eye contact, altered routines, and limited visibility, behaviors that signaled discomfort more loudly than any statement could. The cameras continued to record passively, capturing not just events but patterns, the subtle indicators of stress that reveal far more than overt conflict ever could. A vehicle slowed, stopped briefly, then drove on. A figure stood across the street longer than necessary, pretending to review landscaping while clearly watching the house. These were not acts of authority, they were acts of surveillance born of fear, and fear rarely stays contained. By midweek, the association's attempts to manage perception had grown increasingly erratic. A notice was issued hinting at an impending resolution, followed hours later by a separate communication that contradicted it, referencing unresolved compliance issues without specifying what those issues were. The contradiction was not accidental. It was the result of multiple people attempting to control the narrative simultaneously, each operating with partial information and conflicting priorities. That lack of coordination exposed the truth more clearly than any admission could have. The board was no longer united, and unity is the foundation upon which enforcement authority rests. Without it, rules become suggestions and penalties become risks. The phantom fee, once the linchpin of their justification, had quietly disappeared from the system, removed without explanation, an act that might have gone unnoticed if not for careful documentation. Its sudden absence raised a question far more damaging than its presence ever had. If the fee no longer existed, on what basis had the water been shut off in the first place, and why had it remained off for days afterward? That question hovered unanswered, heavy and unavoidable, and no amount of procedural language could erase it. Internally, the panic likely intensified as advisors and management staff began to distance themselves, offering cautious language and deflecting responsibility upward, leaving board members exposed. The realization that liability could attach personally rather than collectively changes behavior quickly, and that change was now evident in the hesitance of every action taken. What had once been bold overreach was now replaced by indecision. Each potential move weighed against the possibility of worsening an already precarious situation. The board's authority, once exercised casually, now felt brittle, its limits painfully visible. Outside, the house remained unchanged, its quiet persistence becoming almost symbolic, a fixed point around which the association's turmoil revolved. The lack of reaction continued to deny the board the emotional leverage it expected, forcing them to confront the situation without the distraction of conflict. That confrontation was not going well. The longer the water remained off, the more difficult it became to justify any narrative that did not involve error, and error was precisely what the board could not afford to acknowledge openly. The cameras, ever present but unobtrusive, captured the mounting unease, the hurried footsteps, the whispered conversations that took place just out of earshot but well within view. Panic rarely announces itself directly. It manifests through behavior, through avoidance, through the sudden urgency to appear busy without accomplishing anything meaningful. That urgency had taken hold, and it was eroding whatever credibility the association had left. By the end of the 7th day, it was clear that the situation had reached an inflection point. The board could no longer rely on silence or intimidation to resolve it, nor could they continue escalating without inviting consequences far beyond their control. They were trapped by their own assumptions that no one would notice, no one would document, no one would endure long enough to expose the flaw at the center of their authority. That flaw was now impossible to ignore. The water shutoff had ceased to be the issue. It was merely the evidence. The real story had become the unraveling of a system that mistook compliance for legitimacy and discovered too late that legitimacy cannot be enforced through fear. As night fell on the 7th day, the atmosphere felt different again, sharper, more electric, because panic, once it reaches a certain threshold, does not dissipate quietly. It forces action, often reckless, often revealing, and whatever the association did next would not be controlled or calculated. It would be reactive, driven by the need to escape exposure rather than the confidence to withstand it, and that reaction would mark the beginning of the end of their grip on the narrative, carrying the story into a phase where consequences could no longer be deferred or disguised. By the 8th day, the situation crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, because the moment authority loses its ability to contain a problem internally, that problem becomes public by default, and public exposure does not negotiate, it documents and remembers. The water was still off, but now that absence had become a symbol rather than a hardship, a visible marker of something far larger unraveling in real time. What had once been an internal HOA dispute had evolved into a slow-motion implosion, and the association could feel the shift as clearly as a structure feels stress fractures before collapse. The panic that had brewed behind closed doors finally leaked out in ways that could not be retracted. A board member arrived mid-morning with a sense of urgency that bordered on recklessness, their movements sharp, their posture defensive, as if proximity alone could reclaim authority that had already slipped away. The cameras recorded everything, not as an act of provocation but inevitability, because once documentation exists, reality cannot be reshaped later to fit a more convenient narrative. The board member's presence drew attention almost immediately. Neighbors paused, vehicles slowed. The illusion of privacy vanished, replaced by the uncomfortable awareness of witnesses. Authority depends on quiet compliance, not spectators, and the sudden presence of an audience altered every calculation. The board member attempted to appear purposeful, reviewing documents, making calls, gesturing toward infrastructure that had nothing to do with the actual water shutoff, a performance meant to suggest control where none existed. That performance unraveled quickly, because purpose without action reveals insecurity, and insecurity does not inspire confidence. The association's attempts to manage the optics only made the reality more visible. Within hours, contradictory messages began circulating more widely than before, forwarded, discussed, and questioned by residents who had previously stayed silent. Language that once intimidated now sounded hollow, stripped of credibility by its inconsistency. Claims of authority were met not with fear, but with skepticism, a far more dangerous response. Skepticism invites inquiry, and inquiry invites accountability. The phantom fee, long since removed without explanation, became a focal point of discussion, not because of its absence, but because its disappearance raised questions no one could answer convincingly. If the fee had been invalid, why had enforcement occurred? If enforcement had been justified, why had the fee vanished? Those questions circulated quietly at first, then more openly, eroding trust not just in the decision, but in the system that produced it. The board's internal fractures widened under that scrutiny. Members who had once defended the shutoff now distanced themselves, issuing cautious statements that emphasized collective process rather than individual responsibility, language designed to blur lines that were becoming painfully clear. The management company's tone shifted as well, their communications carefully worded to emphasize advisory roles rather than decision-making authority, a subtle but telling retreat that left the board increasingly isolated. Isolation is dangerous for any authority because it removes the buffers that absorb blame. As the day progressed, the association attempted a bold but poorly timed maneuver, issuing a notice that framed the situation as a misunderstanding pending clarification, an attempt to reset the narrative without addressing the underlying facts. That notice failed immediately because by now facts had accumulated faster than spin could keep up. 8 days without water is not a misunderstanding. It is a pattern documented by timestamps, messages, footage, and silence. The gap between the association's words and its actions had grown too wide to bridge with procedural language. Residents noticed. Conversations shifted. What had once been whispered speculation became open discussion. The board's authority, once assumed, was now being evaluated, and evaluation is the enemy of unchecked power. The cameras captured the change in atmosphere, the way people lingered, the way glances followed board members instead of avoiding them. The dynamic had inverted. Those who once enforced rules now avoided attention, while the house at the center of the dispute had become a quiet reference point, a reminder that resistance did not always look like confrontation. The water remained off, but the association's confidence had evaporated. Every attempt to act now carried risk, because any move could be recorded, questioned, and shared. That risk paralysis set in, slowing decision-making to a crawl. Meanwhile, the legal implications loomed larger with each passing hour. 8 days without water was no longer defensible under any interpretation of authority, and anyone advising the board would have known that. The fact that restoration still had not occurred suggested either denial or fear, neither of which mitigated liability. The association was trapped by its own delay. Restoring water now would raise the question of why it had been withheld for so long. Continuing the shutoff would deepen the violation. There was no clean exit, only varying degrees of damage. As evening approached, the most revealing moment occurred not through action but avoidance. A scheduled meeting was quietly postponed without explanation, a move that signaled internal disarray more clearly than any argument could have. Postponement is not strategy, it is retreat, and retreat confirmed what many had already concluded. The board no longer controlled the situation. The narrative had escaped them, shaped instead by evidence, observation, and the simple persistence of a house that refused to panic. The water shutoff, once intended as leverage, had become the association's greatest liability. As night fell, the neighborhood felt different again, charged not with anticipation, but with certainty. Something had broken, and broken systems do not repair themselves quietly. The collapse was no longer theoretical. It was happening in full view, and the next chapter would not be defined by subtle pressure or internal panic, but by a decisive moment where the association would be forced to act publicly. Because once authority collapses under scrutiny, the only thing left is accountability, and accountability does not wait forever. By the 9th day, the situation had reached a stage where delay itself had become a statement, because when authority hesitates too long in the face of mounting evidence, that hesitation is read not as caution but as guilt, and guilt reshapes every interpretation that follows. The water remained off, but now it felt almost incidental compared to what was unfolding around it, because the real flow that had begun could no longer be stopped. The flow of information, of realization, of people connecting dots that had never been meant to connect. What had once been a quiet, isolated enforcement action had transformed into a full exposure of how power was being exercised behind the polished language of community governance. The association's internal panic had finally produced its most revealing consequence. Inconsistency so stark it could no longer be explained away as misunderstanding. Communications began to surface that directly contradicted earlier claims, fragments of explanation that did not align, timelines that shifted depending on who was speaking, and rationales that changed as soon as they were questioned. The attempt to control the narrative had failed, and once narrative control is lost, truth does not need to be dramatic to be devastating. It only needs to be visible. Neighbors who had previously stayed neutral began comparing notes, realizing that similar phantom fees, vague threats, and selective enforcement had touched their own experiences in quieter ways. What had been endured individually now appeared systemic when viewed collectively. The water shutoff was no longer seen as an isolated overreach, but as the most extreme example of a pattern that had gone unchecked for years. That realization spread not through outrage, but through clarity, and clarity is far more dangerous to entrenched power than anger ever could be. The cameras continued to document the association's behavior, but now they captured something new, not escalation or performance, but retreat, the subtle withdrawal of presence, the reduction of visibility, the sudden emphasis on process rather than enforcement. Board members who once appeared confident now avoided lingering in public spaces, their movements quicker, their demeanor guarded. Authority that believes in itself does not behave this way. It does not avoid observation. It does not soften language overnight. These shifts were not lost on anyone watching. Inside the association, the truth was finally being spoken, even if only behind closed doors, because denial can only survive so long when confronted with incontrovertible facts. Someone had acted without proper authority. Someone had approved a shutoff that should never have occurred. Someone had assumed that water access was just another lever to pull, another tool of compliance, without understanding the legal weight attached to it. That misunderstanding had now metastasized into exposure, and exposure has a way of dragging everything into the light, including past decisions that were never meant to be examined closely. The phantom fee that had initiated the crisis became a symbol of that recklessness, its sudden appearance and quiet disappearance now understood as more than a clerical error, but as evidence of a system that operated on intimidation rather than transparency. The longer people looked, the more they saw, and the more they saw, the less they trusted. Trust, once eroded, does not return simply because authority demands it. The association's attempts to reframe the situation as a misunderstanding collapsed under the sheer volume of documented inconsistency. 8 days without water could not be reframed. Contradictory notices could not be reconciled. Silence followed by urgency could not be explained away. The truth surfaced not through confession but through accumulation, each small fact reinforcing the next until the picture became undeniable. This was not enforcement gone wrong. It was control exercised without comprehension, and the consequences were now unavoidable. By midday, the pressure had reached beyond the board itself. External scrutiny loomed, not yet formalized, but clearly anticipated. Advisors who had once offered cautious reassurance now emphasized risk. Management staff became careful to clarify roles, drawing lines that had previously been blurred. Each clarification narrowed the circle of responsibility, leaving those at the center increasingly exposed. The association's power structure, once diffuse enough to shield individuals, now felt brittle, its protections thin. The water shutoff had forced a reckoning not just with one decision, but with the culture that allowed it to happen. The house, still without water, stood quietly at the center of it all, unchanged in posture, its endurance now unmistakably purposeful. What had once been interpreted as passivity was now recognized as resolve, a refusal to trade rights for convenience. That refusal had shifted the balance in ways no one on the board had anticipated. The neighborhood's perception of authority had changed fundamentally. Rules were no longer assumed to be correct simply because they existed. Enforcement was no longer viewed as legitimate simply because it was asserted. Questions had replaced assumptions, and those questions would not be easily silenced. As afternoon turned to evening, the association's communications slowed to almost nothing, a sign that internal deliberations had reached a critical point. Silence, once used as a tool to pressure compliance, now functioned as an admission that no defensible response existed. The truth had surfaced, not in a single dramatic moment, but in layers, each one stripping away another illusion of control. The water shutoff, intended as leverage, had instead become evidence of ignorance, overreach, and a dangerous disregard for limits. By the end of the 9th day, it was clear that the association could no longer resolve this quietly, no matter how much it wished to. The narrative was no longer theirs to manage. It belonged to the record, to the cameras, to the people who had watched the situation unfold and understood what it revealed. The truth had surfaced, and once truth is visible, it demands resolution, not promises, not reviews, not postponements, but action. The next chapter would bring that action, because the association stood at the edge of a decision it could no longer avoid. One that would either confirm everything that had been exposed or attempt, too late, to undo the damage already done. By the 10th day, the story no longer belonged to the homeowners association, nor did it belong solely to the house that had endured without water. It belonged to the consequences that had been patiently gathering beneath every decision made in haste and defended through silence. The moment of reckoning arrived not with a dramatic announcement, but with a quiet inevitability, the kind that settles in when all other options have been exhausted and denial has nowhere left to hide. Early that morning, the neighborhood woke to subtle changes that signaled an end was approaching. Vehicles that had circled cautiously now kept their distance. The usual rhythm of enforcement had not just slowed, it had vanished entirely. Authority, once so eager to assert itself, had retreated into stillness, and stillness in this context was not strength but surrender. The water remained off, but it was now clear that this was no longer a tactic. It was a failure to act in the face of unavoidable. Inside the association, the final conversations were happening, stripped of posturing and pretense, because there comes a point when even the most stubborn confidence gives way to self-preservation. The documents were irrefutable. The footage was comprehensive. The timelines were unforgiving. Every attempt to justify the shutoff collapsed under the weight of facts that had been allowed to accumulate unchecked. The water rights tied to the land stood immutable, older and stronger than any rulebook the association had ever produced, and those rights had been violated openly and continuously. There was no longer any debate about what had happened, only about how much damage would follow and who would bear it. That realization marked the true end of the association's control, because power that can no longer shape outcomes is power in name only. By mid-morning, the restoration finally came, abrupt and unceremonious, without apology or explanation, as if the return of water could somehow erase the days it had been withheld. Faucets came alive again, pipes filling with sound and motion, a physical reminder that what had been taken arbitrarily could be restored just as quietly. But restoration did not undo the record. It did not erase the footage, the notices, the contradictions, or the panic that had unfolded in full view. The water's return marked the conclusion of one chapter, not the resolution of the story. Outside, neighbors noticed immediately not just the sound of water, but the absence of enforcement vehicles, the sudden quiet where authority once hovered. Conversations shifted again, this time not speculative but reflective, as people understood that something fundamental had changed. The association had been forced to retreat, and that retreat had been witnessed. Witness changes everything. The board issued a final statement later that day, brief and carefully worded, framing the incident as an administrative error resolved through internal review, a narrative that might have succeeded in another time, another context, but now rang hollow against the evidence everyone had seen accumulate. The language avoided responsibility, avoided acknowledgement, avoided learning, and in doing so, confirmed everything the situation had already revealed. This had never been about process or compliance. It had been about unchecked authority meeting its limits. The house stood unchanged, not triumphant in any visible way, but grounded, its endurance having accomplished what confrontation never could. By refusing to panic, by choosing documentation over outrage, it had allowed the system to expose itself fully, revealing the fragility beneath the facade of control. The association, once confident that its rules defined reality, now understood that reality exists independently of enforcement, anchored in law, history, and rights that cannot be overridden by convenience or ego. The reckoning was not loud, but it was complete. Board members would carry it forward in quieter ways, through resignations disguised as routine turnover, through policy revisions framed as improvements, through a newfound caution that replaced their former certainty. The neighborhood would carry it too, in the form of questions asked more readily, rules examined more closely, and authority no longer accepted on assumption alone. The water shutoff had been intended as leverage, but it ended as a lesson, one written not in conflict but in consequence. Beneath the surface of manicured lawns and orderly governance, something had shifted permanently. Power had been challenged not through force but through patience, and patience had won. The story closed not with celebration, but with clarity, the understanding that systems built on intimidation eventually collapse under scrutiny, and that rights, when understood and defended calmly, outlast any attempt to control them. The water flowed again, but the illusion of unchecked authority never would, because once the truth surfaces and is seen, it cannot be buried again, no matter how quietly the pipes are turned back on.